Thank you all for attending this moderated discussion. My name is Ilgaz Arikan, and today we have 6 billion people who are experts at their craft. The participants need no introduction. That's why I'll skip the introductions and for the sake of economizing on time. And I'll refer you to their bios posted on the events webpage if you like. I'm actually a bit confused and very curious about things I thought I knew well. Maybe you share my curiosity as well. Surely the firm Coase talked about in 1930s is different from the firms we talk about today. The firms in 1950s, 1980s were also very different from what we see around us. In the past, when we talked about globalization, supply chains, competition, we probably meant different things. And some of you might say, well, logic is the same, perhaps. But I'm not sure if our theories are equipped to handle firms acting like states and states acting like firms. And I'm not really clear who the principal is or who the agent is in the AI context. And surely I'm confused about property rights, ownership rights, control rights of stakeholders. There are many stakeholders now. I lost track of it. I'm not sure what it means when McDonald's sanctions Russia. And is all this specific to the geopolitical context we are in? Or does China, Brazil, India, Germany, France, the UK, do they see the playing field the same way or differently? In short, what does it mean for the modern firm to face unavoidable, unstoppable, and unpreventable rivalries? We have 4 panelists, Barney, Oliver Hart, David Teece, and Stephen Walt, to have this conversation on these topics. Asli, Arikan, and Luigi Zingales will cross-examine the panelists, ask questions, and make comments. I'll monitor the chat box and direct the audience questions and comments to Asli and Luigi, and they can incorporate them when appropriate. And we basically have 6 rounds of engagement. It will follow a unique format that will allow the panelists to not only answer questions, but also to comment on each other and explore points of divergence. In the opening round, each panelist will have 5 minutes. In rounds 2, 3, 4, Luigi and Asli will take about 1 minute per panelist to ask questions and make comments. Then each person will respond for the next 3 minutes. 3 minutes. In round 5, the cross-examiners will have one last chance to engage the panelists. And in closing, the panelists will have 4 minutes on their final round. We'll start with Stephen Walt, and then follow with Oliver Hart, Barney, and David Teece. Let's just begin.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be participating in this discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing what other people have to say. So by way of full disclosure, I'm not an economist. I hang out with them a lot, but I hope to convince you that a scholar of international politics might still have something to say about the role of the firm. So I want to make 2 preliminary points and then draw some general implications. The first point is that security is more important than wealth or profits, because it doesn't matter how rich you are if you're dead or if you lose your independence. If you remember what happened to Kuwait back when Iraq invaded in 1990, had the United States and others not come to Kuwait's rescue, that small nation's vast wealth would have been gone, absorbed into Iraq. Similarly, if the United States only cared about making money, we wouldn't be restricting the export of advanced semiconductors to China and doing some other things that I'll talk about in a second. A second point is we often get the relationship between peace and interdependence backwards. Many people believe states are less likely to fight when they're closely tied economically, and there is some evidence that on average interdependence does make war a bit less likely. But it is not a guarantee. Close trading partners have fought on numerous occasions and sometimes fought very big wars. So it's more accurate to say that peace fosters interdependence. When the risk of war is small, firms can invest abroad with greater confidence. They can create complex supply chains without worrying that those links will be disrupted. Firms worry less about blockades and sanctions, and governments worry less about whether close economic ties are going to benefit another country more than it benefits them. The United States didn't worry very much that China would gain more from trade than we would back in the 1990s. Now we worry about that a lot. All right, so what does this all mean for firms today? Well, the unipolar moment is over. Great power competition is back. Consider that the United States is now simultaneously trying to inflict a military defeat on Russia in Ukraine and something of an economic defeat on China in advanced technology. There are serious conflicts underway in Africa, Central America, and the Middle East. There is some danger of a war over Taiwan or with Iran. And most importantly, instead of trying to promote greater economic integration, as the United States has done for decades, both the Trump and Biden administrations have embraced a more protectionist approach in key areas, largely for geostrategic reasons. I think this situation creates some serious headwinds for global firms. American agribusiness was hurt by Trump's trade war with China. U.S. consulting firms in China are under increasing scrutiny and legal pressure from the Chinese government. Just yesterday, China imposed limits on memory chip sales by Micron in what was, I think, clearly a tit-for-tat response to U.S. export controls. The United States has pressed foreign firms to go along with those export controls, and we've threatened to impose secondary sanctions on firms who do business with countries like Iran. There is one big exception to all this bad news for global firms, and that is, of course, that defense contractors are going to do very well for all of the obvious reasons in an era of inexorable rivalry. A third problem is geopolitical rivalries of this sort create some reputational risks. For example, Yale School of Management now maintains a website listing firms that do business with Russia, which of course makes it easier for concerned citizens to name and shame them. So again, an era of rivalry creates reputational problems for firms, and they also face risks to their personnel. As most of you know, journalists, including several US citizens, have been imprisoned in a number of countries. And so was women's NBA player Brittany Griner in Russia for over a year. A few years ago, 2 Canadian citizens, one working for a non-governmental organization and the other a business consultant, were imprisoned in China, which was, of course, retaliation for Canada's detention of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei. My last point. Growing geopolitical competition over global standards. The United States and its allies wrote many of the standards that govern key areas of technology, such as a lot of the internet protocols. Today, however, China and others are pushing for revised protocols and other regulatory standards that would facilitate surveillance, limit privacy. The United States and others have leaned the other way. Conflicts over regulatory standards rarely get much attention, certainly not on the front pages of most newspapers, but I think they're going to have a major impact in some sectors, and that's going to be shaped by geopolitical competition as well. So my bottom line is simple. As geopolitical rivalries intensify, business firms are going to have to pay a lot more attention to politics and geopolitics than they have for a long time. And with the exception of firms working directly in the national security area, this is going to increase costs and risks for firms and make the easy profits of the past 3 decades a lot more elusive. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Beautiful. Thank you. That sets the stage beautifully. Oliver Hart, please.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. Can people see that? Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. Let's see whether I can actually move this. Yes. So some of what I'm going to say, I think, fits quite well with what Stephen was just talking about. A major challenge facing firms today is how to deal with social issues. We live in a world where stakeholders, consumers, workers, and shareholders care about what firms are doing with respect to the environment, diversity, and politics. And a big question is, how should firms deal with this? The traditional view is that firms should do whatever it takes to maximize profit or shareholder value. Even with this view, which I'm going to argue is quite narrow, even with this view, the job of a CEO is not easy. Let's take the example of a firm exiting from Russia. Stephen mentioned that Yale has made Sonnenfeld has made a big issue of this, and so it's very easy to see whether firms have exited or not. So just looking at it from a profit maximizing point of view, if you've been doing business in Russia and you exit, there's going to be a loss of profit in the short term. On the other hand, if you don't exit, then maybe your workers are going to get upset and make trouble, or perhaps it's going to be harder workers will quit, or it's going to be harder to recruit new workers. Consumers may boycott your company, and so that may cause a reduction in long run in profit in the long term. So how do you balance these things? It's not easy to do it. Although maybe that is the job of the CEO. But let's turn to a domestic example of this, which I think where in the domestic context the problems can be even more challenging. Think of a bank that has been doing business with gun manufacturers in the US and now is thinking about stopping that. Again, the consequences for shareholder value may be ambiguous. Presumably the bank was making profit from these transactions, so it's going to lose that. On the other hand, maybe it's getting some resistance again from workers or other customers of the bank not to favor gun manufacturers. So weighing those things up is going to be difficult. And however the CEO decides it, because it is ambiguous, so even if they say they're maximizing shareholder value, it's not really clear whether they are. And so they're going to get flack from people on the right. If they stop doing business with gun manufacturers, they're going to be accused of being anti-gun by people on the right. On the other hand, if they continue to do business with them, they're going to be attacked from the left for being pro-gun. I think one of the ways out of this dilemma is for the CEO to elicit the view of their shareholders, their investors, the shareholders. There's increasing evidence that shareholders, as well as other stakeholders, are willing to give up some profit in return for a firm doing what they think is the right thing. So I mentioned one paper, but there are many others. This paper is by Luigi, David Thesma, and myself, where we ask shareholders in hypothetical situations, or people who we say, you're a shareholder, and how would you react if the firm you own doesn't exit Russia? And we find that these stakeholders, well, let's focus on the shareholders. They're not just interested in financial return. They have other interests. They're socially responsible people to some extent. So they care about money, yes, but they care about other things. And so they might be willing, let's go back to the example of the bank, shareholders in JP Morgan or a bank like that might say, you know what, doing business with the gun manufacturers is profitable, but we don't like it because we think it's hurting American society, these companies. And so even though it's going to reduce profit, we're willing to accept that. So you could imagine the bank asking its shareholders what they think. And if the majority of the shareholders want the bank to stop doing business with gun companies, then the CEO can decide that. And the good news in that case is that it's going to be hard to, whoops, not quite sure what happened there. Okay, did I press the wrong button? Probably. Okay, try that again. Yes. Oh, okay. So we are on the right slide. So I think that's what I was going to say, that if the CEO is acting having solicited the views of shareholders, then I think that takes them out of the political limelight. So, it's going to be hard to attack them either from the right or from the left if they've consulted shareholders and found out, well, the shareholders either do or do not want them to stop doing business with gun companies. So the bottom line, and this, let me just conclude with this, is that, it's often argued that if companies move away from the single-minded goal of maximizing shareholder value, that's sort of fairly clear what it means, even though it's not always clear whether you're doing it, but it's pretty clear. It's a one-dimensional goal. That if you move away from that, that's going to create huge problems and it's going to be a total mess. But I would like to argue that the opposite may be true. It actually may make the job of a CEO or a board of directors easier, because they're not going to be subject to political tax, since they can say, we're just doing what the owners of the firm want us to do, and that's what we should be doing. And so bottom line, shareholder democracy, by which I mean letting shareholders express their views more clearly in companies, following what the shareholders want in terms of social goals, that this can actually make navigating an increasingly difficult terrain easier for CEOs. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Oliver Hart suggested a democratic solution to the CEO problem, which actually makes me more curious, because CEOs are not voted in, they are appointed, and they are very powerful, actually. So sometimes more powerful than presidents. Now, Jay Barney, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I've already enjoyed these comments enormously. Stephen, I really love your conversation about the global politics. It's very important. My comments are going to be closer to Professor Hart's. Let me start with what I hope is a provocative statement, which is a few years ago, the members of the Business Roundtable put together a statement saying that they were no longer looking to simply maximize shareholders' wealth, but we're now going to be committed to addressing the interests of all of their stakeholders. My view is that that statement is without content. And the reason it is without content is that the only way that a firm, CEO or managers, however you want to define it, the only way a firm could address the interests of all of its stakeholders is if those interests happen to be completely aligned. And that is such a rare event that the statement that you're going to the firms are going to address all of the firm's stakeholders' interests is meaningless. The question is, which stakeholders are you going to focus on and when? Who is in the influence? That is, whose interests are you going to address and whose interests are you not going to address? That is a non-trivial problem. Now, it turns out the field of strategy has made some progress with respect to that question. And that story is, if in fact one of the purposes of the firm is to generate economic profit, in fact, maybe a purpose of the firm is the creation and allocation of economic profit among stakeholders, then it's clear that in order to going to generate that kind of economic profit, it's very likely you will need, aside from monopoly, it will very likely that you will need various stakeholders to make firm-specific investments, co-specialized investments in each other to create a value that could not be created in other ways. But in order to get stakeholders to make those specific investments, you need to induce them to do so in the face of all the challenges that are associated with making those kinds of specific investments. And one way to handle that problem, and address that problem, is to make at least those stakeholders who are critical in the profit generation process to become residual claimants. Now, this is already happening. This is not rocket science. So firms are already identifying critical employees and making them residual claimants. They're already identifying critical suppliers, even critical customers, and making them residual claimants. and having claims on the firm's economic profits. It does imply that there's another group of stakeholders, the fixed claimant stakeholders, who do not necessarily have a claim on a firm's economic profits. Those are the people who are sort of out of that conversation. The firm, I think, still has obligations to those people, certainly to pay them a fair market-determined wage and maybe some other ethical and moral responsibilities. But it's less clear in the economic logic that they should be treated as residual claimants. Now, there are still difficult problems associated with facing CEOs and other managers as they try to, as they adopt this approach, this stakeholder approach. So, for example, identifying which of your stakeholders are actually most critical for generating economic profits is a non-trivial problem ex ante. It's relatively easy to know ex post, but ex ante not such an easy problem to do. Plus, inducing these people to make specific investments by promising them that they will become residual claimants is problematic because those promises are not always credible. And then finally, ex post, once profits are actually created, allocating those resources, those profits among these mission critical stakeholders is also a difficult challenge. That said, it does seem to me that in a world where firms are dealing with multiple stakeholders, being able to decide who is in and who is out, rather than pretending we can satisfy everyone, which seems incredible, I would say. That has the potential for addressing some of the issues that Professor Hart identified. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. So Jay Barney mentioned that deciding which stakeholder is more important was the question. And I think it was easier to decide who would be the important shareholder, but not the stakeholder. But now hearing from David Teece, please.
Well, thank you. And the question you put to us has two parts to it. The first one is, how will the firm be impacted by the current global social, political, and economic rivalries? And I think the answer to that is that it's going to be impacted in a fundamental way because the nature of competition has changed. And when I say the nature, I mean the nature as we've lived it for the last 70 years. We're going back to times maybe in the interwar period that are perhaps more similar, but there's a change in the nature of competition. And let me sort of break that down into a number of elements. First of all, managers and firms have got to operate in this world of deep uncertainty. This is not about risk. This is nighty and uncertainty. On the one hand, driven by technological change, and on the other hand, driven by geopolitical disturbances. And quite frankly, most of our management textbooks are not written with that in mind, although some of them are. Secondly, digital competition. There's a digital component to competition, and that means that network effects, scalability, and so forth play a role, not an inexorable role, but there is the digital competition is quite frankly different from the kinds of competition we've lived through before. Thirdly, and most critically, is with the rise of China, we're facing for the first time in recent history a situation where firms in the Western world are competing with firms that are inexorably tied at the hip with government. It's what I call systemic competition, that when competing with China, you're not just competing against Chinese firms, you're competing against a system. And while that's also true with respect to Europe and the United States, it's there's a decoupling, a significant decoupling between the firm and government, and a degree of remoteness there, but that's not true in China. And that means that you have to calibrate competition in completely different ways. Also, there is now increasing fusion of civilian and military technology And so that brings in the national security element in ways that hasn't been true for quite some time. And we're getting, as a result of that, export controls, sanctions, and many other things. So my first point is, in response to the first part of this, is that there is a fundamental change in the nature of competition. And if I can quote Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, he made a statement that I think is relevant for our purposes. He says, "We are counting on businesses to pursue growth responsibly, assess risk soberly, and work with us to not only protect but strengthen our national security." And this is a different mandate that firms in America haven't had to live with for a very long time. And so that's sort of my quick response to the first part of the question, recognizing at the same time that competition may be dividing into blocks, or the global economy may be dividing into blocks, and with bifurcated governance. The second part of the question was, what does it mean for a firm to face unstoppable and unavoidable rivalry? And to me, that raises some old questions and some new questions. Competition that's driven by technology, of course, is very Schumpeterian, and it tends to be more powerful than the type of competition that we have in our textbooks. It's not the type of competition that's existed in the world, but our textbooks have simplified competition, so we have a very naive view, driven essentially by the field of economics, which has a very static formulation of competition. But in this new world of innovation or Schumpeterian competition, incumbents challenge each other. You see Microsoft with chatbox going after Google. You see new entrants challenging incumbents, new entrants like BYD in China and Tesla challenging the traditional automobile companies. And you see new entrants also challenging incumbents such as Tesla challenging Toyota. Why is this competition unstoppable? Is this rivalry is something that's inexorable? Yes and no. It's inexorable when it's powered by industrial policy. When the treasury of the nation state gets behind a firm, then the normal limits on capital expenditures are put to one side. So you have an industrial policy component, not just in China, but now emerging in the United States and being in Europe also for quite some time. So there is new forms of competition, and some companies are winners and some companies are losers. Companies like Intel now, with support from the CHIPS Act, are the darlings in Washington, and they're assisted by government. On the other hand, big tech companies in America like Google and Meta are facing significant regulatory challenges. So the landscape is incredibly complicated, and that's something we need to take account of. But this new era, if it is a new era of industrial policy in the United States, has been seen before. In the Hamiltonian period in the 19th century, the United States had an industrial policy, but until very recently, its industrial policy is a dirty word. But now it's come in with the CHIPS Act and is likely to come in other areas as well. So let me just leave it there for the meantime, but summarize it by saying that business in the West is both simultaneously pilloried by government, as with the tech sector, and assisted at the same time. So there are not only geopolitical cross currents, but there are domestic political cross currents, which are making for deep uncertainty and difficult managerial challenges.
Thank you, David. Thank you for mentioning the three elephants in the room by name. Perfect. Now, Luigi Zingales will ask questions one by one. First to Stephen Walt.
Thank you, and thank you for all your speeches that are very enlightening and very stimulating. So let me start with Stefan and ask, you have been worried about the losing position in America in the world dominance, and I think that now is a reality. So given this reality, do you believe, like was referred that Secretary of State Blinken was suggesting, that firms should behave patriotically against their financial interests? So to make an example very concrete, go to China. It's profitable to share technology with China, but even when this is not formally prohibited by the US government, should they limit those sharing, those technological transfer in order to preserve the national interest?
I think as a practical matter, they're going to have to. We're in a fundamentally different era than the last 30 or 40 years. We had this unipolar moment where suddenly people thought barriers were going to keep dropping everywhere, and therefore firms could go out and just make money wherever they could find potential profits. And the whole world was essentially integrated into that. If you think back to the Cold War, of course, the Soviet bloc didn't engage economically very much with the Western world, and there were pretty strict restrictions through COCOM and others to prevent firms from doing that. The second point that reinforces this is the fact that nationalism is a very powerful force, more powerful than the loyalty anybody feels to a firm, right? Nobody's willing to, take up a gun and die for Apple or Meta. But they will do that for their country. And I think firms that are perceived, this gets back to some of the points that Oliver made, firms that are perceived as acting unpatriotically or willing to pursue profits even at the risk of jeopardizing the country in which they are headquartered are likely to face a significant backlash or face genuine regulatory pressure from different governments, whether it's the home government imposing restrictions on them, or whether it's a foreign government doing that. So I think that, as a practical matter, states firms are going to have to pay more attention to the sort of political stars as they are lining up, and yes, be perceived as acting patriotically, even as they pursue profits.
Thank you. Oliver, after Citizens United, many people are concerned that companies have too much political power. Aren't you concerned that maximizing shareholder welfare would lead to more involvement by companies in the political debate and potentially even excessive involvement of companies in the political debate?
Well, I'm not sure why it would necessarily go that way. I mean, so, I was arguing that companies need to listen to what their shareholders want and do it. And I think in some cases that's going to lead to less political involvement. Take lobbying efforts. Often lobbying efforts can be good for the bottom line, but that might be bad for the world, and shareholders as citizens of the world might be against those lobbying efforts. We might be talking about lobbying against carbon taxes or something like that, which is the economist's solution to climate change. But oil companies may be trying to make sure those things don't happen. But if they listen to their shareholders, they might find that their shareholders, either because they don't want to live in a hotter world themselves, or their children or grandchildren, they don't want them to have to face that, or they may just be concerned about, people 1,000 miles away, not related to them, may be concerned about what's going to happen to them. So they might actually say to the oil companies, stop doing this. So that would be an example where I think there would actually be less political involvement. Now, can I imagine other situations where it could go, the other way? Yes, I could imagine those too. I think we just don't know. Thank
you very much, Oliver. Jay, I like very much your classification about the critical role of various stakeholders. I want actually to push you to analyze an example. I'm sure you follow what's happening with Walt Disney. And my understanding is that the real force behind Walt Disney walk position are the employees actually of Pixar, who are number one, employees of a subsidiary of Disney, and number two, living in California. But they are the really critical ones. So with all due respect, but it seems that the janitors and the employees working at Disney World in Florida are substitutable, so don't matter, while the basically critical employees of Pixar have a role. Now, if that's the case, and if the political involvement by companies become important, aren't we risking really an oligarchy of the more talented, that they have the power to deploy an enormous amount of resources and de facto blocking a democratic process?
I was with you up to the last of the democratic process. So yeah, there is a. So are we talking about voting on like proposals for the company or democracy more broadly?
No, democracy more broadly is the fact that whether we like it or not, but the Parental Guide Act was approved by a legitimate assembly and a legitimate governor. And the fact that we have Disney working very hard to repeal that reform, it seems that Disney has become a political organization in Florida run by non-Floridan people.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I don't pretend to be able to analyze or answer all these really difficult questions, because you're exactly right. The critical stakeholders in Disney, non-shareholder stakeholders in Disney, many of them are employees. That will typically be the case. You want to be able to induce those employees to make specific investments in the company that then generate the kind of creativity and programming that Disney is known for. So and those are going to bump up against the sometimes they're going to bump up against other political interests. But I mean, this idea that we could sort of pull our stakeholders and find a simple solution that everyone would like, sort of a kumbaya kind of, we can all just get along, doesn't seem likely in many circumstances. In this case, if I was working with Disney, I would say you do have to keep those stakeholders involved and committed. You do want to take this point of view, recognizing that it's going to be costly for you in Florida, and that has happened. And that's the trade-off you have to ask: is the value created by the relationships we maintain with our employees worth the downside of no longer having our own tax area and whatever other kinds of political costs are associated with our activities? But to pretend that there's some simple solution that will make everyone happy seems pretty naive.
Thank you very much.
I'm not suggesting that what you were proposing, but you're pointing to the dilemma that exists and the trade-offs that have to be managed.
Okay, thank you very much. David, I really like your analysis, but let me play for a second the devil's advocate, because you are describing an ideal world that used to be. And while I agree that the world in the future might be different, I don't think the past was as clean cut as possible. Let me tell you a story. When AIG was about to fail, there was an offer from the Chinese government to buy AIG at a good price. And the Hank Paulson did not even consider that offer. And the rumor has it that did not consider the offer because AIG is actually the location of most of the US Secret Service agent. And so they don't want to sell AIG to somebody who might be a foreign enemy. And this is just an example of how American companies have been really tied very closely with the US government. And so are French companies with the French government. And so Italian companies with the Italian government, to the extent that Italy has any big company, and so on and so forth. So what is new, if not more of the same?
Well, I think there's a step function difference. You are right. There's always been elements of that, but in fact, the pretty much the narrow pursuit of profits and shareholder interests has squeezed out issues such as national security, and companies have been willing to license technology without much consideration for the long-term impacts on themselves, let alone on the nation state. I can see the point, but I think that it is dramatically different at this point because there's a realization that national security is now an issue, and that there's no longer, the United States no longer has the lead it once had, and so it's starting to covet the technologies it does have, because technology leadership is really what is the foundation stone for not just national security, but economic security as well.
Luigi, do you have any follow-up question to David?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now it's Asli's turn. We'll repeat the same format. Asli will ask questions and make comments to Walt, Hart, Barney, and Teece.
Thank you. So how I'm going to come at this is I see a unified problem for all the fields that's represented by our great panelists. So I'll start with 3 examples. And then once I complete my question, I'd like all panelists to take a stab at it. So the examples are, the first one is Amazon. So I'll give you some scope ideas of Amazon. All of us know it. It employs 1.2 million. And in comparison, federal government has 1.8 million. And its market value is approximately 1 trillion. That's equal to local tax revenue for the United States government. So it's around 1.2 trillion. So it's a massive, massive size. And it has close to 2 million small to mid-sized businesses. And if you look at the entire small to mid-sized business population, it's around 30-some million in the US. So consider that size. And now consider its activities. It sponsors and writes bills for housing projects and public transportation lines in Seattle. It develops new degrees for 200 and has ties with 250 higher education institutions. It has law enforcement operations for human trafficking. It has business, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion certification services. So it sets standards in that domain. It has a satellite broadband communication network system. It is almost a sole supplier for federal, local, state governments. It takes on the Florida state's medical pharmacy operations. And interestingly, and this probably speaks to most of our panelists' comments, and including Stephen as well, Amazon Web Services are provided to national security, defense, and intelligence communities almost exclusively. And it's hiring 100,000 veterans to actually operate the AI operations for the United States defense and national intelligence. So here's one example. The second example is Warren Buffett sells his sizable shares in Taiwan. This is a recent news, and this is how he explains it. I don't like its location. I wish it weren't sold, but I think that's a reality. And he goes on to say, one of the best managed companies and most important companies in the world. And I'm kind of thinking through the theories that I'm familiar with and how would we explain this business decision. And I think this goes back to Stephen's comment. He's making a choice, which we're not able to explain economically, but maybe he knows something that we don't, so he exits. And this also gets back to David's comments. And last example is states targeting foreign firms directly, like US and TikTok CEO, when he's talking to the Senate committee, he says, well, 5 million US businesses use our services to sell. They'd be very hurt. So it's kind of like undertoned threat to say, well, if I exit, then your own businesses, your own constituencies will be hurt. You see the similar thing with Microsoft and UK over Activision acquisition, which is, I believe, a classic case of antitrust, where the acquisition is a vertical acquisition and it makes the video gaming industry completely 70% in the control of Microsoft. So even the percentage is straightforward textbook case of, we have a monopoly situation. It's litigated in the UK and it's been rejected. And you see the CEO's comments on the UK regulatory agencies, UK government itself, and says, well, maybe it has become too hostile for us to be here for all our operations. So again, another kind of closed threat. So the size and the power to influence the rules of the game in IR, economics, and business really go hand in hand. So if we think about that, and if we realize states are outsourcing domestic operations and some aspects of foreign policy to large corporations, and then large corporations are acting like states in their domestic content as well as with some global reach, then we have some sort of a mixed playmate situation. You have IR including large corporations as actors, and then you have corporate competition including governments. Given this kind of background, how would our respective theories in these fields handle or withstand or absorb or react to the blurring lines between states and corporations as governing structures, organizing structures?
Thank you, Asli. So we'll start with Stephen Walt.
Okay, well, I'll give you the sort of standard international relations answer, which may be wrong. I've taken a position here in some prior debates with people, and that would be that when push comes to shove, ultimately states are going to win out, right? That the question you've raised, and it's really a central one, is, are there some private firms that really are not just too big to fail, but too big to control? They've managed to wire themselves into the system in enough ways that you simply can't restrict them. I challenge you to say that we've had companies like this in the past at earlier periods. Large integrated firms that seem to have enormous weight, enormous political influence, and eventually governments, for various reasons, decided they had to clip their wings. Now, that's been easier to do for some countries. Look at how China has dealt with Jack Ma over the last few years than it has been in the United States. But even the United States in the progressive era and other periods was able to bring monopolies under control in various ways. And one of the points I sometimes make to my students is to say, yes, there are these remarkable corporations that exist that seem to have enormous resources, enormous reach. But if you asked yourself, who do you think is going to be around 100 years from now, Microsoft or France? I would bet on France over Microsoft. I would bet on the United States of America over Amazon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, because states still have coercive power, still command the loyalties of their citizens in the ways that firms do not, and ultimately, set the rules, establish the legal framework under which corporations have to operate. I think at the end of the day, it's governments that are going to matter most. It's politics that's going to matter more than the sheer footprint or economic power of different firms.
Thank you. Asli, do you have a follow-up question for Stephen Walt?
No,
Okay,
I see his point.
Okay, next is Oliver Hart, please.
Yes, well, you raise, very good questions. I think my view is that it is clearly a concern when we have these massively powerful firms, large firms, which potentially can compete with states, and particularly if they are operating across borders, they can be they may not be more powerful than France or the United States, but they can certainly be more powerful than smaller countries. What to do about it? I mean, I think two things I would favor, or at least thinking about. One is enforcing antitrust policy in a more stringent way. I think what we've seen in the last through decades is antitrust policy becoming much more lax, and a lot of the merger, these companies are sometimes getting bigger through merger, and I think that we should be much more suspicious about that way of becoming large, and we should put more restrictions on them. But also, of course, sometimes they become larger and more powerful through organic growth, and then the question, traditionally, very little has been done about that, because that's sort of regarded as it's the market at work. These firms are obviously efficient. They're taking advantage of economies of scale or network effects, and we don't want to stop that happening, because it's sort of basically a sign of success. Well, I'm not so sure about that. I think that at some point maybe we should be requiring these firms to behave in different ways. So in my remarks I talked about shareholder democracy, but I think when we're talking about very large firms, shareholder democracy may not be enough, or may not be the right approach. Actually, this is something that Luigi and I have been thinking about, but I think other people are also thinking about it, the idea of imposing on the management of these very large firms a responsibility to act in the social interest rather than just in the private interest, in the interest of their shareholders. So I could imagine a situation where we put more constraints on their behavior, and it wouldn't just be regulation, it would be actually trying to change the objective function of these companies, because they're that powerful that we have to recognize that they have an impact on society as a whole, and they should behave responsibly with respect to that. The exact way of doing that is not simple by any means, but I think that we should be thinking about that kind of approach.
Thank you. Asli, any follow-up question for Oliver?
Just a quick one. If one of the wrinkles that I hope to revisit in the next rounds as well is the production of social interests, you might call it a type of capital, social capital, and the production of value-based, let's say generally named moral capital, used to be exogenous to the corporations, that domain of economic activity. You'd have religious institutions and education on one side, and you have government and politics for social capital creation on the other end. But if we now make it endogenous, that firms that engage with the generation of this capital and trying to create value in these spaces, this idea of how to manage and reshape the firm might become trickier. So either now or in the next rounds, if you would kind of come back to this, I'd appreciate it.
Well, let me just say quickly, I think this separation that you have alluded to existed, but it was false. It didn't make sense because companies, for-profit companies, can do harm in the world, right? They can follow the laws, but they can still be doing things that many people would regard as undesirable, whether we're talking about polluting a river, could be in the US, but it could be in India or Africa, where regulations are more lax, but the people, I was talking earlier about the shareholders of those companies might say, you know what, we don't want you to pollute. Yes, we can be wealthier if you do it, but we think it's the wrong thing to do. So because companies are very much involved in doing harm or good in the world, this idea that we should somehow ignore that and just tell them to focus on the bottom line, which has been the conventional approach, I think it's based on a logical error.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
You shouldn't stick with that logical error.
Thank you. Jay Barney, please.
Well, I totally agree with the antitrust issues that have been raised. These are particularly a problem in industries with positive network externalities. We understand this, and the economies of scale story, and the rising government power. And I do believe that we're already seeing or have seen pushback from government regulators. Stop and start, be the first to admit that with regard to these antitrust issues. Recall there was a large Microsoft suit. There is for antitrust suit that was settled. Google, Meta have been in front of the Congress, and I don't think those CEOs had particularly good days during those experiences. So there is some of that work going on, and I agree with that. Here's where I'm very, very concerned. I think I'm consistent with Professor Hart and Zingales when I say that I do not favor a government policy that mandates that firms should try to maximize shareholders' wealth in the decisions they make. There are some countries where that is the case. I would not support that as a policy. In the same way, but I would also not support a policy that says firms must engage in some socially responsible behavior. They have to do ESG, and that's not a government policy. The vision I have is a vision where investors and stakeholders get to choose. I'm not anti-firm profits. If someone wants to invest in a firm or wants to become involved in a firm as an employee, as a stakeholder in a firm that is truly trying to maximize profits in the free economy, that should be an opportunity for them. On the other hand, if you want to invest in a company that is totally committed to ESG and social causes, that also should be completely an opportunity for those investors and those employees and other stakeholders as well. So I would be very supportive of closely applying antitrust logic to these terms as they get very, very large. I think the solution of forcing them as institutions to either follow more social welfare kinds of things, social programs, not social programs like ESG and others, is troubling to me. I will tell you, I am particularly troubled by investment companies and organizations who attracted capital based on the assumption that they were going to maximize the wealth of their shareholders. And then those institutions, once they gain monopoly power, switch the game and are now investing in ESG and social causes. I think that's bait and switch. I think it's probably not legally fraud, but it's deeply troubling to me because it's very costly to rearrange those investments. And so that's troubling to me. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. David Teece, please.
David is disappearing.
Hi, it appears that David had some connection issues. I'm working with him to get him back on the call. Maybe best to just go ahead and move on for the moment.
Okay, while we wait for David, I'm curious, how much of what we just said, how much of what we just answered would be relevant for a firm in China and a firm in the UK, firm in Italy? Would they answer these questions this way?
Who are you asking about? Or is it just a generic question?
Generic question to Jay, because he said, my advisor Jay said, employees making firm-specific investments, and he actually talked about more than a minute on that one. Is this really true today? Because I really see human capital as being extremely or highly transient. And
certainly some human capital is highly transient, but firms, the theory suggests that firms that are able to induce employees and other stakeholders to make firm-specific investments of the co-specialized kinds of team production and all those things should be able to generate economic profits in doing so. And that is true. We know, for example, the various regions, production regions in Italy, where the specific relationships exist between small companies for design purposes. I know this used to be true. I don't know if it still is. That was a classic example of using those kinds of specific human capital investments to generate economic value. So, I mean, we'd have to look case by case, but I think that's great. Luigi, am I wrong? Are those regions, design regions, gone away, or?
They have lost a lot of their momentum, I have to
Yeah,
say.
no, that's probably true. It's hard to maintain this stuff over long periods of time. Opportunism raises its ugly head.
Okay, thank you. David joined us without video, but his audio is working. So David is going to answer Asli's question now. Thank you.
Sorry, yes, I've just come back on and don't know what happened. I apologize. What is the question?
I'll just briefly repeat it. I gave examples of Amazon,
Yes,
Warren
I heard
Buffett.
that.
Okay, and then the question is, if we have blurring lines between states and
Yeah.
corporations as organizing structures, do the theories and how we think of competition and what firms are really or states are really are working.
Well, listen, I heard Stephen's remarks, and I agree 100% that the state is still unquestionably the top dog. You know, Amazon doesn't have an Army, Navy, and an Air Force.
Not
Yeah.
yet.
But in addition to that, it is regulated in many ways. And of course, there's always the shadow of antitrust. More than the shadow of antitrust, there is direct antitrust cases proceeding with regularity, and not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. But I do think behind your question and your observation, there is something worth remarking on, and that is in the new world we're going into, and the tech firms and the big firms have to understand this, that the untrammeled focus on shareholders alone isn't going to cut the mustard and will result in further regulation. And in my view, we have to think of ESG, redefine ESG. The G stands for governance, but I think into the G, we also have to put national and economic security if we're realistic about the world that we're now in. And you know, Jay Barney remarked that you know, a lot of this multi-stakeholder stuff is completely without content if you throw everything, including the kitchen sink, into it. And that's exactly what you know, the Business Roundtable seem to be doing. But I think what we have to do is take a long-term shareholder view here, and essentially a stewardship view. And coming back to all of his comments, I'm not sure that the way to do this is to do a poll of the shareholders. That is a cop-out for leadership, in my view. You know, it's kind of like Bill Clinton politics: put your finger to the air and see what the people want. Leaders are supposed to lead, and that's true not just at national level, but at the corporate level. And, you know, Jiro Nanaka wrote a piece in the Harvard Business Review a number of years ago about the wise leader. And, you know, unfortunately, we're incenting our business leaders to do the short-term stuff because we're tying it to shareholder returns. And in fact, I have a question back to Luigi. What is a shareholder these days? You know, if you look at the average hold period in the stock market, it's collapsed and it's down to seconds in many cases. And what we have in many cases is traders masquerading as shareholders. To me, a shareholder, I underscore the word holder, somebody that's in there for the long run. Most people are not. And so managers, to bring about alignment between national interest and shareholder interest, managers have to get up and you know, look for the broader, longer term survival of the enterprise and the stewardship of the enterprise, and sweep this nonsense under the rug and start focusing on true social responsibility, which is a long-term growth and survival of the enterprise, because that's what's going to deliver jobs and prosperity and preserve democracy.
Thank you. Now we're going to have Luigi do one more round of questioning, including this answer to David Teece.
Absolutely. So let me start going in steps. First of all, I like very much Asli's focus on these two large governance structures, the government and the firm competing one against the other. I'm a little bit less sanguine than Steve in thinking that the government will always dominate. First of all, I think that there is a difference probably if you have a US perspective or if you have a Italian perspective, because the US government is much more powerful than the Italian government. But also, I'm not so sure that, number one, your bet is necessarily a winning one. If we were in the, let's say, in the 1910s, and we're betting a lot of firms in the United States, where they were around 100 years, or countries in Europe, where they were around 100 years, I'm not so sure what the odds are. And especially if you say countries that still are in the same place as they were in the past with the same borders is kind of, has changed a lot in 100 years. But also, more importantly, and you mentioned that, in many historical episodes, we have seen firms co-opting countries for their own strategy, from the East India Company starting wars against China to the role that many cartels in Germany, particularly IG Farben, play in the Nazi war. So it wouldn't be past me that we have a small military-industrial complex that runs with the excuse or the pretense of security, will run the country for the interest of the military-industrial complex. After all, when Eisenhower mentioned the military-industrial complex, we had at least 50 major defense contractors. Now we're down to 5 in the United States. So basically 5 companies control our defense. And I think they're more powerful, honestly, than a president like Biden. I think that Biden is replaceable, but those firms are not.
That's great. That's a nice riposte to what I said. I mean, first of all, I don't want to imply that states are all powerful, and I certainly don't want to imply that firms are impotent and just, dependent variables that governments can do whatever they want. I do think if you take sort of a longer historical view, though, the state has become, in a sense, more powerful over time. I mean, back in the era of multinational empires, there were largely ungoverned spaces where, the Dutch East India Company could operate. And that one of the things we've seen over the past several hundred years is that every inch of the planet has now been, become the property of a state government. Some of those governments aren't particularly effective, don't govern particularly well. And in those spaces, corporations can come in and do a variety of things much more readily. But in the more well-regulated and well-governed parts of the world, I think, firms still have to work very hard to make sure that the government is doing what they want. And even in the case of the military-industrial complex, yes, they extract lots of money from relatively complacent American taxpayers, but I don't think, Lockheed Martin actually determines what American foreign policy is going to be vis-a-vis different areas. Similarly,
sorry if I interrupt you. ENI in Italy does determine the Italian foreign policy. So that's an example of which, ironically, a state-controlled company controls the state in the way they run foreign policy.
You'll have to explain that to me some other time. I'd love to hear it. In any case, but this is not a question of one side or the other dominating. It's simply a question of where you think the preponderance of power lies, and in particular is going to lie in an era when geopolitical competition is increasing. Because in fact, as countries, as populations begin to worry more about security questions, they don't turn to Amazon or Microsoft or Tesla to provide that. They ultimately turn to the government. After 9/11, Americans looked to the US government to make them feel safer again, and not to different companies. The government then would contract with some of those companies for some of that service provision, but it had to be a state response. And I think we're heading into an era where you're going to see more of that rather than less.
Thank you. So, Oliver, you're mentioning the discussion we had in the past about what kind of restrictions that we want to impose to very large and powerful companies, maybe to have limit on not pursuing the social interest. But what I realize in this discussion is we already have these restrictions today when it comes to military interest, because one thing that emerged very clearly, and please people disagree here, is that everybody in this panel agrees with the fact that at least when it comes to US firms, they cannot operate against the military interest of the United States. And in one way or another, whether openly or maybe more behind the scene, but the US government will enforce that all the firms are aligned in the military interest of the United States. So it's not true that they are free to do what they want. They are really constrained de facto in pursuing a certain strategy. What do you think of this idea?
Well, I have two reactions to that. First of all, I don't deny it in that case, but there are lots of other cases where I think, firms are relatively unconstrained. If we're talking about, we might be talking about exercising monopoly power or monopsony power. Maybe they are, reducing wages, not hiring as many workers as they want, knowing that their actions have an influence on wages because they're big in the labor market. Now, if they had a different objective function, they might not do that. That's something where I don't think the US government is going to be hot on them, in contrast to, say, defense. So I think, yes, it all depends on the context. Can I take this opportunity to respond to something that David said, which is about leaders have to lead? I mean, let me ask David the following. Take the situation of a company which is deciding on political contributions, whether to make them. I also gave the example of lobbying efforts. That would be fine, but another example would be making contributions to particular political candidates, or let's take those. What does it mean to lead in a situation like that when you don't? The question is, what should you? If I was a CEO, I would be thinking, what should I be maximizing? Should I be maximizing shareholder value? That might lead me in one direction, but if I'm maximizing shareholder welfare, on the other hand, that might lead me in a different direction. So I don't think the idea that CEOs should poll their shareholders on every issue. This is, of course, crazy and not something I would be advocating at all. If you're thinking of introducing a new product, you're not going to ask the shareholders if that's a good idea or not. That's your job. But when it comes to something which has social implications, as indeed lobbying efforts or political contributions do, then I think that you need to know what your shareholders want in order to know how to lead.
Well, when you say your shareholders, it comes back to Luigi's questions. Who are your shareholders? How long are they going to be there? Your job as a CEO is the long-term stewardship of the organization. And the way, when you have these conundrums, and there's plenty of them, I agree, you're not going to get the answer to the long-term shareholder view by taking a poll of your current shareholders. This is where you have to override, the popularity contest of the moment. This is something that I don't think is given sufficient consideration. And hopefully, the CEO is better than the crowd. I mean, what you're doing is sort of crowdsourcing a decision. So the question is, can the top management team do better than the crowd, which is your shareholders, in framing and executing a decision for the long-term growth and prosperity of the enterprise? Because that's your job at the end of the day.
So let me ask a question to Jay, and then I will return to the issue with David. So Jay, you went out of your way not to mention one elephant in the room, which is BlackRock. When I thought that when you're describing somebody that collects a lot of money and then managed in a different way, you had in mind BlackRock. And so let's ask a question. Number one, how should they behave? Because of course they have a fiduciary duty to act in the interest of their owners. But I'm not so sure that they have a fiduciary duty to act in the financial interest of their owners, and particularly when they raise funds with the explicit label ESG, which, by the way, charge a higher fee for the privilege. They should behave differently. And historically, they have not. So if there is one issue at BlackRock is that they deceive customers by pretending to be ESG and they're not the other way around. What do you think?
No, I think that's a good observation. My first point is, I think it's completely reasonable for a firm like BlackRock or anyone else, if they want to create ESG funds, if they want to advertise those funds as focusing on ESG rather than other kinds of objective functions, and people can choose to invest in those funds. So I have zero problem with that at all. As I said, hey, I prefer more freedom when it comes to making those investments rather than less freedom. One of the problems, of course, with ESG funds is no one really knows what ESG means. And so what we have is a very weird situation where we have this huge emphasis on ESG with really no good measures, no understanding. It's very quickly leading to a lot of confusion in my mind. Now, I expect that to get cleaned up over time. To me, that's a disequilibrium. There's enough people, I believe, who are interested in these issues that groups will emerge that perhaps will be able to address them in some more interesting and systematic way. But as to the having a portfolio of funds, some profit maximizing, wealth maximizing, some ESG, that shouldn't be just not a problem. In the same way, I actually have clients who are B Corps who are explicitly focusing on a social mission as part of their, but it's not a surprise to anybody. I mean, we're a B Corp, that's it anywhere. And so these people that this program I'm working with actually have private equity owners. And the private equity firm is committed to supporting their social mission. So none of that's a problem in my mind. My problem is bait and switch. That's all.
I agree. So David, I'm a little bit worried by the kind of implication of what you're saying, because it reminds me a lot of people that say voters don't know what they're doing when they vote, and leaders of the country should lead the country in the right direction and in the interest of the nation overall, and not in the petty interest of voters who don't know what to do. I think these positions were the position of many fascist governments, including the one that ruled Italy for many years. So are you trying to translate the same idea into corporations? Because if your concern is the transient nation of shareholders, then you can say, let's index funds vote, because index funds are actually, they don't move because they're indexed and they stay there for the long term. And particularly all of us who have invested in index funds in the S&P for our pension, we don't trade continuously. And so should we have more vote? But the idea that you make somebody completely unaccountable, because if the only thing that the leader should do is do something that is not well-defined in the interest of a non-well-defined entity in the long term, you're basically saying that the leader is completely unaccountable. And one of my favorite lines is that the thing that is closest to Soviet election in the Western world is the election of board of directors of corporation, because you have many seats as the elected. The incumbent choose the people, and you can vote yes or abstain. And even if you abstain, they get elected anyway. So I think that really we are in a problem of major unaccountability here.
I don't think so. Let's take Amazon. If Jeff Bezos had grown Amazon by taking a shareholder vote, the shareholders would have told him to stop building the company. And Steve Jobs wouldn't have oriented Apple toward the iPhone if you're doing it by vote. And when Oliver is very clear that you shouldn't delegate everything to the shareholder. But I hear it, Oliver, to say if it's a real sticky wicket, then you delegate it to the shareholder. But those that pursue, in my view, those that pursue shareholder value now, end up actually degrading shareholder value. That's what went on at Intel for a while, and now they've turned it around by putting a technology guy there. So I observe that founders of companies drive greater shareholder value longer term by thumbing their nose at the short-term market considerations, and often they don't always get it right, but I've got a lot of confidence in founders because they have this long-term vision and the wisdom to make good decisions. So So I know this is a very tricky area, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but no, I'm not suggesting that that managers should be able to do what the heck they want, but boards of directors should be behind them. Part of the problem is we don't have boards of directors that really understand how to build long-term value anymore. They're put on boards for all kinds of reasons that, you know, maybe it's stakeholder representation or whatever, but the fundamental role should be building long-term value and stewardship of the enterprise. And that's what I want to see happen. And there's accountability to that through the board.
I would like to ask you many more questions, but I think my time is up, so I leave the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is the last round. We're going to use this time to ask any question that is burning a hole in our chest, get it out, make any comments that you would like to make, any follow-ups on anyone that you think should hear this response. We'll start with Asli, then Luigi, then in an order, Walt, Hart, Barney, and David Teece finally. Thank you.
I'll make two broad comments. One of them is I see the general theme emerging as a problem of defining the production function of what a firm is and what a state is, because we see most of those activities that we would expect the government to do appear on the production function of the firm and vice versa. And in that respect, I want to circle back to Stephen and maybe pose this question. If we had some sort of an equation that predicted accurate policy and in international relations, and think about the mistakes that you would think, the order of prioritizing China versus Russia versus other security threats, if we had the activity of corporations on the right-hand side, would we be able to explain some of the divergences that you mentioned in your writings and in your talks, that maybe the prioritization would have been explained by the presence of corporations actively being present in policymaking? So I'll just throw that out there. And the second angle, which is directed more towards firms and competition and theory of the firm, is, and I think, David, you're going to appreciate this, is there is also the legal aspect of all this domain, that we have a grassroots efforts that's globally led by US, Canada, and UK, and it's called B-Lab in the US and Canada. And what they're pursuing is change in law that brings in the idea of public benefit corporation designation. And where this designation is concerned, you have basically the following characteristic, and I'm just going to read it just to be accurate. And it says, benefit corporation status protects company missions through capital raises and leadership changes, creates more flexibility when evaluating potential sale and liquidity options, and prepares businesses to lead a mission-driven life post-IPO. And what this means is the ESG, or social purpose, the purpose-driven organization, is immune to board changes, immune to CEO changes, immune to classic corporate governance tools that we take for granted in the context of theory of the firm. So how do we kind of manage that with respect to we take our production function given, right? We have capital, labor, and we have the intangible assets thrown in there. So what do we do in this kind of moving, muddy state of also the legal environment? Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi.
I will have just a telegraphic point for David. I think that the difference is whether it's an issue of value or values. I think that on the issue of value, I'm very happy to defer to the CEO, because he or she is supposed to be an expert on the topic. But when it comes to an issue of values, I think that that the CEOs are not elected for their representatives on values. And if they make some choices that are value-based, I think that I want to have more of a broader base to base these choices on.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that. But in looking at values, I think the CEO has to connect values through to value. In other words, if you don't get the values right, you won't be around for the long term. So value will decline. So I think in the longer run, the two are sort of inextricably linked.
In the very long run, we're all dead. We know that.
I've heard that.
Could I make a quick comment about that? I mean, take the example of a gun company, a company that is actually making guns, and maybe some of them, legally, some of them are dangerous. I mean, that is, are high-powered weapons that a lot of people think should not be available, but this company is making them legally. Now, suppose the shareholders of the company, who after all own the company, these are the owners of the company, suppose they want that company to stop making those particular weapons. I'm not quite sure what you would say about that. I mean, someone, the CEO of this company, who is looking at the long run, from there, what is the long run? How would you judge the long run success of this company? That it's very profitable because it makes dangerous weapons, or because it gives up some profit and actually perhaps contributes to a safer America? I'm not really sure how a CEO can decide that issue, but I think the shareholders could and should.
Well, but the CEO ought to be able to think through the longer term implications, because they're running the company and they know all the elements of it. Individual shareholders do not have a rich understanding of all the elements of corporate growth and survival. So I'm not sure the delegation that you have in mind works for capturing all the information that's needed to make the right decision.
Isn't there a market solution to this problem? So it goes like this. So if a gun manufacturer continues to manufacture very dangerous weapons, and more people in society are opposed to them manufacturing such weapons, then demand for that stock for value reasons would fall. The prices of shares would fall. At some point, there's an opportunity for an acquisition. Someone else could acquire the company that has that does not want to engage in that manufacturing, acquire the company and change the policy. The demand then for investing in that stock by these many people who prefer to not see that kind of manufacturing take place goes up. There seems to be a market solution to this, but
this sounds like
very questionable, Jay, if you don't mind me saying so, because this company making these dangerous weapons is actually very profitable in my hypothetical.
No,
and
that's
there
right.
are going to be plenty of people who are willing to pay a lot to buy the shares of the company because they're yielding a big return. So I'm not sure.
But all of that, this
to
market mechanism is just a different way of talking about your shareholders voting, except they vote with their money rather than being told. You would expect, for example, for the reason you described, you'd expect the shareholders that in fact invest in a company that makes dangerous guns to strongly support that. So if you told those people, there's a selection factor here. You're going to get a perspective that is not likely to be consistent with this broader value. So I'm not at all clear to me that asking those shareholders they should get rid of guns. I know what the answer you're going to get is. They voted by investing in the company that they want those dangerous guns.
Except we all buy indices. We all buy indices, and the indices we're stuck with it. So you might own a gun company even if you don't want to.
That's fair, but that's also a choice that you've made, Luigi, as a consumer, as an investor, saying, I personally don't care about what the strategies and values are of these individual firms. I'm interested in investing in the economy as a whole. You've made that choice, okay? And should that be disciplined? No, we can't do that. That's illegal. In the United States, you have to invest. You can't invest in those kinds of investment funds.
I am not an expert here, but this sounds to me like the political equivalent of the efficient markets hypothesis.
No, I have to admit that it is that. I'll grant that. And I'm not pretending it always works, nor am I pretending it's costless. But I don't see these alternatives as particularly effective. And certainly, if you wanted to ask the state shareholders of one of these firms, if they should continue to make dangerous weapons, I know what they're going to say.
No,
They're
actually,
going to say yes.
All is for the best in this best of all possible worlds.
That's right. One hopes,
actually,
one hopes.
you know, the shareholders of Ruger, which is one such gun company, actually, there was a resolution which passed by a majority asking,
Well, there you,
calling on Ruger.
so it seems to work after all. So that's okay. I'm fine with that.
Can I recommend a paper that Luigi and I wrote together with Eleonora Brocado called Exit versus Voice?
Yes, I know it.
Okay, so it deals very much with the issue. You
Sure,
know,
this issue, I agree with you entirely. I understand that. I'm just saying, the exit versus voice logic does not lead to the conclusion that CEOs should poll shareholders. That's the voice is exercised in a variety of ways, and polling is one of them. But I'm not convinced by that particular argument. I've totally got the voice story. I totally understand it, and voice can be exercised in a variety of ways, including acquisitions.
Interesting that I lost control, and I'm quite happy about it, actually.
So you have to understand, I have enormous respect for both Oliver and Luigi. Enough respect to disagree with them.
But it actually is interesting. It boils down to Oliver with Hart and Luigi's paper, but also it boils down to how vocal the CEOs are. Some of them are quiet and smart, and some of them are very vocal and not so smart. The tobacco company CEOs are quite quiet and very profitable, and they continue to pretty much run a mint shop at the backside of their factory, while the my pillow CEO has been quite vocal and not that smart, actually, the way that he handled it. But is there anything that needs to be said before we start closing the discussion? Let me go in an order. Stephen Walt, please.
Yeah, sure. So Asli in her comment talked about what role would firms play in shaping foreign policy. I think it depends a lot on what issue you're talking about. Certainly, defense contractors have a big impact on scaring the country by, giving money to think tanks and things like that. But if you look at some big foreign policy decisions, the decision to invade Iraq, for example, I don't think firms had anything to do with that. The United States spent over $1 trillion fighting a war in Afghanistan. That was not a war driven by sort of corporate interest, even though there were some corporations that made money doing that as well. And I could extend examples like that. To wrap this up, I would just reiterate, we're in a fundamentally different world. I think we will look back on the period 1992 to 2016 was the anomaly, not the current period as well. It's going to be an era where at least major power governments are going to be more actively involved, affecting what firms do in a variety of different ways, subsidizing them, restricting them, and all of them with an eye towards trying to improve their chances in sort of a competition for power with the countries they see as their rivals. I might add that governments are not going to do this particularly well. They're going to make some bad bets and good bets as well, but they're going to do more of that. This situation of inexorable rivalry is also going to create opportunities for some others. The war in Ukraine, tragic though it is, has allowed India to get oil at bargain basement prices for a while. The rise of China allows Saudi Arabia to play Beijing off against Washington in a variety of ways. Chinese restrictions on Micron create opportunities for South Korean chip manufacturers to sell more to China. So it's not like it's all bad news for everyone all of the time. And then the last point I'd make simply is that this is not going to end anytime soon. Your worst case forecast for China is still a very substantial player in your worst case forecast. Your worst case forecast for the United States will remain a major player as well. I think Russia is actually going to be declining in relative terms for a long time to come, but it will still be a factor of geopolitical consequence. You can even look to countries like Japan. Japan has announced it's going to double its defense spending by 2027. And that's going to make it, I think, the third largest defense spender in the world, third or fourth as well. So this situation is not going to end anytime soon, and that means that politics is going to continue to matter in lots of important ways. And anyone, any of those responsible CEOs are going to have to pay as much or more attention to politics, both geopolitics, but also domestic politics, than they have in the past.
Thank you. Oliver, Hart, please.
I think I've spoken.
Thank you. Jay Barney.
No, me too. I've enjoyed the conversation enormously.
Beautiful. Thank you. David Teece.
Yeah, I think I find myself resonating very much with what Stephen Walt was saying. And what's really going to be different is the systemic competition that comes from China is going to be more characteristic of competition in the EU and the US and elsewhere. In other words, it's no longer a competition of individual firms. It's a competition of economic systems. And of course, it's not a pure model of systemic competition. And it's going to be a very, very clumsy model in the EU and the US. But firms are going to be tied to the nation state in ways that they haven't been in the past. They've basically had free rein and focused on shareholder interests. That is going to be cabined in on a go-forward basis. So there's a geopolitical side that's impacting competition, but there's also the technology side, which hasn't been given as much emphasis as it should be. And the emergence of digital platforms and AI is fundamentally changing the way, the nature of competition. Although one should not believe that those that get ahead will stay ahead. There's nothing inexorable in this, and that this is where management comes into play. Firms that are better managed will do better. There's no casting of the die at the beginning that can't be undone. And the firms that are better managed are going to have a different type of manager than the financialization gurus of the last 50 years. We've probably been training the wrong type of managers. The IB community, I think, has been doing better than most, but business schools in general have been training managers for a world that no longer exists. So we need to change our education system as well. So, and we need it to understand the importance of capabilities. Enterprise level capabilities are what's critical, particularly their technological capabilities. And we need to recognize that competition is dynamic. So the economics textbooks in particular, I think, need major revision. And I want to end by quoting from Oliver Hart, actually, a very nice article way back in 1989 in the Columbia Law Review, where he said most formal models of the firm are extremely rudimentary, capable only of portraying hypothetical firms that bear little relation to the complex organizations we see in the world. And that's the sorry state of the social sciences. So hopefully the field of international business and strategic management can give a lift to the theory of the firm, because as you can see, there's a lot of richness in the firms, a lot of heterogeneity in firms that are out there. And our theory building is way out of step with the realities. That's been true for a longer time, but the distance between the theories and the reality is getting even bigger. And that's the job that we as scholars have to fix.
Beautiful. Last comments from Asli. Arikan.
I'll just take this opportunity to thank you, our host and the conceiver of this panel discussion. It was a great idea.
Thank you. Luigi Zingales, please. Any last
I just thank you. I think it was great. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you all for your time and
you.
effort,
Yeah.
for your thoughts. Well, we can stop recording now. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Pleasure.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. That's great.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Great job.